During the early years of Americanization of the conflict in Vietnam, starting in 1965 and really ranging to the Tet Offensive in early 1968, you're seeing the American military fighting the war in ways that resemble the way that it fought in previous conflicts. And to quote a Vietnam scholar named William Sorley, once Creighton Abrams takes over, America begins to fight a better war. In every respect, the American military evolves into something different, something that it has not been before. The American military is fighting a counterinsurgency war, and it's beginning to fight it with better skill. The United States military, although it still possesses the capacity to fight large unit actions, it still has the capacity to conduct search and destroy missions on a large scale. The American military begins to investigate and to develop small units. When American combat troops fight in the Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam, beginning in 1965 with the full Americanization of the conflict, we begin seeing this rifle in the hands of U.S. troops as the XM16E1, which is really the Colt Model 603 in its pre-adoption version. This is an interesting point of the development of the M16 because the Army and the Air Force are using different models. The Air Force adopted it first. The Air Force was using a version without the very familiar forward assist device. The Army chooses to go with the forward assist device, and so in the early phase you're seeing rifles that will lead to M16 with and without forward assist. And the military as a whole, all branches, move toward the full adoption of this weapon system, which ultimately then happens in 1968, where it's adopted across all branches as the M16.
In the course of the year and a half that I spent in Vietnam, I spent every minute of it in the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Regiment of the 1st Marine Division, the United States Marine Corps. I chose to extend my tour by 6 months in return from a guarantee from my regimental commander that I could go back to being a rifle company commander again. The question comes up sometimes when I say that I was in Vietnam during the M14 era of, what do you think of the M16? The Marine Corps did not do the best job of phasing that rifle into service. They were forced by circumstances beyond their control to literally have Marines walk by the back end of an open 6x, throw their M14 in, take a few more steps, and get handed an M16. The training was not complete and detailed, and we found very quickly that the rifle had problems that needed to be addressed with training.
When you combine that with putting the wrong gunpowder into the cartridge, you ended up with U.S. Marines dead, having their rifles stripped apart, trying to get a busted case out, a ruptured case, and it was a crime. It was a tragedy. But once they diagnosed the issue with the powder, the M16 got better, and that's really the story of the M16 rifle. The gun continued to evolve, it continued to get better. So the guns used in 1970, different from the guns used in 67, 68. They learned, they fixed the problems, and once they had diagnosed the problems and addressed them, the M16 became a fine service rifle within the limitations of its cartridge, which is the 5.56.
There are those to this day that continue to pronounce the bad reputation of the M16. But there's a reason why it has served our military for a half a century. That's because it's a very effective firearms design. And it became the icon that identified the American experience in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s. Because our troops, overwhelmingly armed with the M16A1 rifle in both the Army and the Marine Corps, Navy SEALs, other branches of the U.S. military, they take that firearm into combat, and that becomes a defining feature. It is visually something that immediately makes you think of Vietnam, especially when you consider the way that the anatomy of the AR-15, M16, M4 carbine design begins to change in the 1980s. That old configuration, triangular hand guards, a 3-prong flash hider, the carry handle, the plastic furniture, that configuration, the anatomy of the M16A1 in the 60s and 70s is something that makes us automatically think of the struggle in Vietnam.
Want to know what's happening at American Rifleman? Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. We'll be right back.
The firearm that truly becomes the great icon representing the American experience in Vietnam is the M16. And in this cutaway version of the M16A1, you can see some fascinating details regarding its anatomy. Now, the M16A1 is a gas-operated select fire carbine weighing just over 7 pounds, firing the 5.56 by 45 millimeter M193 cartridge using the direct gas impingement operating system. You can especially see here the gas tube running along the top of the barrel inside the handguards. Direct gas impingement vents gases, pushing the projectile at the gas port here, transmits those gases through the gas tube back down to the barrel extension or upper receiver, where those gases act upon the bolt carrier group, causing it to move to the rear, where the bolt carrier group then overcomes spring tension. We can see the spring is mounted inside the buttstock of the rifle, and that pushes the bolt carrier group back into battery, allowing for repeated shots. By virtue of the XM193's light recoil impulse, the M16A1 is a firearm that is controllable on full auto. So the move away from battle rifles made of iron, wood, and steel toward a rifle making use of aircraft-grade aluminum and plastic is not one that was so terribly ill-informed. It equips the average rifleman with a firearm that is significantly lighter, that allows the rifleman to carry far more ammunition, and with the 1 in 12 twist of the rifling of the M16A1 firearm, you have an extremely lethal package in just over 7 pounds.
The M16 is not a big rifle, but there are times that even a small rifle is not what you want. And that led to the evolution of the CAR-15, of the XM77E2. And you end up with a shorter barrel. You end up with a longer flash hider. And that was a gun that was issued to Special Forces troops, to the men of SOG, to some Green Berets. And it really paved the way for a gun used by our troops today, and that's the M4 and M4A1 carbine.
I arrived in Vietnam in December of 1968. I was a qualified Special Forces soldier, a young one at that time, and I was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group, which required that I go to Nha Trang for further assignment out to the field, and eventually I ended up in a unit. The code name of the unit was Command and Control, but in reality it was a covert operations unit called MACV SOG, S-O-G, or the Studies and Observations Group. When I first arrived in SOG Recon, we did not all have CAR-15s. There was a shortage of them. Eventually, I finally got my hands on a CAR-15. But it was more compact. It had a retractable stock. It had a heavy steel compensator. CAR-15s we had initially, we only had 20-round mags, which that was the standard for the U.S. Forces in Vietnam. However, one day I was looking through a gun magazine, it might have been the American Rifleman, and I saw an ad from Sherwood Distributors of Beverly Hills, California. They had 30-round magazines. So all the recon team leaders got together and we pooled our money and sent off a money order to get magazines so that everyone on our teams, Americans and Indig, would have at least one 30-round mag. That would be the first round you fired. For psychological effect, we also loaded that first magazine with nothing but tracer. And if you've got five people, 6 people, soldiers shooting 30-round mags, like one right after the other in an immediate action drill, and it's all tracer, consider the psychological effect on the enemy. And that's what you needed. All you wanted to really do was break contact with the enemy, get a head start of a couple hundred yards, and you stood a good chance of losing them, at least for a while, in the jungle. The ergonomics on the CAR-15 made the difference between life and death, the kinds of firefights we shot. And I certainly can't take credit for originating it, but we had a shooting technique that we practiced, semi-auto, where we'd always fire 2 rounds, boom, boom, because you couldn't tarry long on this target because they're assaulting you. And we had times where teams had a whole enemy company, 100 NVA assaulting them, and life and death is getting out those rounds and knocking down bad guys. But we'd shoot twice, boom, boom, because it doubled the odds of hitting them, and you couldn't even pause long enough to be shooting again because there's already another one over here, boom, boom. We just knew that's a good way to shoot, semi-auto. Maybe that is where the double tap came from, which Delta Force certainly practiced well.